The morning Elara Vance arrived at the DeLuca Vineyard. The fog was so thick she could barely see the iron gates. She drove her old pickup truck slowly, the wooden hives strapped carefully in the back, their soft humming, the only sound besides the crunch of gravel under her tires. She had worn her best work boots, but they were still caked with dried mud from her last job, a small organic farm that had paid her in vegetables and a handshake. This was different. This was the DeLuca estate, a sprawling empire of rolling vines, stone terraces, and a name that made people in 3 counties lower their voices. Everyone knew the DeLucas were not just winemakers. They were power, they were danger, and they had called her a curvy beekeeper with a quiet voice and dirt under her fingernails, because their vineyard was dying. Elara parked near the main house, a massive stone villa with dark shutters and a red tile roof that gleamed wetly in the mist. She stepped out, her boots sinking slightly into the soft earth, and immediately felt eyes on her. A group of people stood near the tasting room, holding crystal glasses of wine, even at this early hour. They were sleek and polished, the women in silk blouses and the men in tailored jackets, their laughter carrying across the courtyard like the clinking of expensive jewelry. Elara tugged at the hem of her worn canvas jacket, suddenly aware of how her curves filled out her practical trousers, how her hair was pulled back in a simple braid, how she carried the scent of honey and beeswax instead of perfume. She was not supposed to be here. She knew that. But the bees did not care about money or power, and neither did she. Not anymore. A tall, thin woman with platinum hair and a burgundy dress stepped forward, her heels clicking on the stone pathway. She looked Elara up and down, with the slow, deliberate cruelty of someone who had never been told no. "You must be the bee person," she said, her voice dripping with amusement. "I'm Victoria Hale, the vineyard's chief investor. We were told to expect an expert, but I have to say, you look more like someone who got lost on a hiking trail." The group behind her laughed, a chorus of polished, dismissive sounds. Elara felt the familiar sting of humiliation, the heat rising to her cheeks, but she did not look away. She had been mocked before, for her size, for her silence, for the way she preferred the company of insects to people. She had learned to let the words slide off her like rain on a hive. "The bees don't care what I look like," she said quietly. "They only care if I listen." Victoria's smile tightened, but before she could respond, a new voice cut through the morning air. It was low, calm, and carried absolute authority. "Miss Vance, you're early." Elara turned and saw him for the first time. Dante DeLuca stood in the doorway of the villa, his silhouette framed by the dark interior. He was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a simple black sweater and trousers that somehow looked more expensive than anything the investors had on. His hair was dark, silvered at the temples, and his eyes were the color of cold coffee. He moved toward her with the quiet, controlled grace of a man who had never needed to rush, because the world waited for him. The investors fell silent. Victoria's smirk faded into something more careful. Dante stopped a few feet from Elara, his gaze dropping to her muddy boots, then rising to her face. He did not smile. He did not mock. He simply looked at her, and for a moment, Elara felt seen in a way that was almost terrifying. "You brought the hives yourself," he said. It was not a question. "I always transport my own bees," Elara replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "They know my scent. It keeps them calm." Dante nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. "Good. The vineyard has been losing its pollinators for 6 months. My previous beekeeper quit. He said the land was cursed." He paused, and something flickered in his expression, something dark and unreadable. "I don't believe in curses. I believe in answers. Can you find them?" Elara looked past him, toward the endless rows of vines that stretched into the fog. She could feel it already, a wrongness in the air, a silence where there should have been the hum of life. "I can try," she said. Dante's jaw tightened. Trying is not enough, but it's a start. He turned and walked toward the vineyard, clearly expecting her to follow. Elara grabbed her equipment bag from the truck, a heavy canvas satchel filled with smoke canisters, hive tools, and a worn journal where she recorded every observation. As she passed the investors, Victoria leaned toward a man beside her and whispered, loud enough for Elara to hear, "Honestly, Dante must be desperate, hiring some strange, heavy little beekeeper to save a multi-million-dollar operation. It's almost sad." The words hit Elara like a physical blow, but she kept walking, her boots pressing firmly into the earth. She had learned long ago that the best revenge was not words, it was knowledge, and the bees were already telling her something was very, very wrong. The first hive inspection took 3 hours. Elara worked alone, moving through the eastern section of the vineyard, where the vines were still healthy, their leaves green and glossy in the strengthening sun. She opened the hives carefully, her hands steady, despite the weight of the morning's insults. The bees were active, their honeycombs heavy and golden, but she noticed something strange. The foraging patterns were off. The worker bees were returning with pollen, but they were avoiding the western slope entirely, flying in wide arcs around it, as if an invisible wall had been erected. Elara marked the behavior in her journal, her pencil scratching against the paper. Bees did not lie. They did not have politics or greed. If they were avoiding a section of the vineyard, it was because something there was dangerous. By midday, the sun had burned off the fog, revealing the full beauty of the DeLuca estate. The vines stretched across gentle hills, their roots deep in soil that had been cultivated for over a century. Elara walked toward the western slope, her senses on high alert. The air changed as she approached. It was subtle, a faint chemical sweetness that did not belong in a vineyard. She knelt and pressed her fingers into the soil, bringing a handful to her nose. There it was, a residue, almost imperceptible, but definitely artificial. Her heart began to pound. This was not a pollination problem. This was sabotage. She was still kneeling in the dirt when a shadow fell over her. Elara looked up and saw an old man with a weathered face and hands like twisted roots. He wore the faded coveralls of a vineyard worker, and his eyes were the pale blue of a winter sky. "You're the bee woman," he said, his voice rough but not unkind. "I'm Matteo. I've worked this land for 40 years, since before Dante was born, since his mother owned it." Elara stood, brushing the soil from her hands. "The bees won't come here," she said. "Do you know why?" Matteo's expression flickered, a shadow of something old and painful. "This land has secrets," he said quietly, "and not all of them are buried in the past. Be careful who you trust, Signorina. The vines are not the only things being poisoned." Before Elara could ask more, Matteo turned and walked away, his figure disappearing between the rows of trellises. She stood there for a long moment, the weight of his warning settling over her like a cold shroud. Then she took a small glass vial from her bag and collected a sample of the soil. She would test it, she would find the truth, and she would make sure that whoever was destroying this land would regret ever underestimating a quiet woman with muddy boots. That evening, Elara was summoned to the main house. A young man in a dark suit escorted her through the villa's grand hallways, past marble statues and oil paintings of stern-faced DeLuca ancestors. She felt acutely out of place, her work clothes rumpled and her hair escaping its braid, but she held her head high. The room she was led to was a private study, its walls lined with leather-bound books, and its windows overlooking the darkening vineyard. Dante DeLuca sat behind a massive mahogany desk, a glass of red wine untouched at his elbow. He gestured for her to sit, and she did, perching on the edge of a velvet chair that probably cost more than her truck. "What did you find?" he asked, his voice low and direct. Elara took a breath. "The bees are healthy, but they're avoiding the western slope. That's not natural. I tested the soil, and there's a chemical residue. I don't know what it is yet, but it's not fertilizer. It's something that doesn't belong." Dante's expression did not change, but his fingers tightened around the stem of his wine glass. "You're saying someone is poisoning my vineyard?" It was not a question. "I'm saying the bees are telling me something is wrong," Elara replied. "And bees don't lie." For a long moment, Dante simply stared at her. Then he leaned back in his chair, and something shifted in his dark eyes. It was not warmth exactly, but it was interest. Deep, calculating, dangerous interest. "No one else has noticed this," he said. "My agronomist, my vineyard manager, my investors. They all said it was a natural die-off. But you walk onto my land for one day, and you find poison." "I listen," Elara said simply, "to the bees, to the plants, to the soil. They tell me things that people miss." Dante stood and walked to the window, his back to her. The silence stretched, heavy and electric. When he spoke again, his voice was softer, almost contemplative. "My mother used to walk these vineyards every morning. She said the land had a voice. I thought she was being poetic, but maybe she was right." He turned back to face Elara, and his gaze was intense enough to steal her breath. "I want you to stay, not just for the bees. I want you to find out who is doing this. You'll have access to everything. My staff, my records, my land, and you'll be protected." The word hung in the air, weighted with unspoken meaning. Protected from what? From whom? Elara felt a shiver run down her spine, but she nodded. "I'll need a lab to test the soil samples," she said. "And time." Dante's lips curved into something that was almost a smile. "Time. I can give you. The lab is already being arranged. And Miss Vance?" She looked up at him. "The people who mocked you this morning will not do so again. That is a promise." Elara left the study with her mind spinning. She had come here to save bees, not to uncover a conspiracy. But as she walked back to the small guest cottage Dante had assigned her, she passed the tasting room and saw Victoria Hale through the window, laughing with a man Elara did not recognize. There was something about the way Victoria's hand rested on his arm, something conspiratorial and cold. Elara paused, hidden in the shadows, and watched. The man handed Victoria a folder, and she tucked it into her designer bag with a smile that did not reach her eyes. Elara's heart hammered. She did not know what was in that folder, but she knew one thing for certain. The bees had led her to the edge of a very dark secret, and she was about to walk straight into it. The next 3 days were a blur of work and observation. Elara set up her hives in the healthy sections of the vineyard, carefully monitoring the bees' behavior. She collected more soil samples, water samples, even samples of the grape leaves themselves. She sent everything to the lab Dante had arranged, a private facility in the city that asked no questions and delivered results quickly. In the meantime, she walked the vineyard every morning and evening, her journal filling with notes about plant stress, scent changes, and environmental patterns. The western slope was getting worse. The vines there were beginning to yellow, their leaves curling at the edges. Whatever poison was in the soil was spreading. Matteo found her again on the 4th day, this time near the old stone well at the edge of the property. He was carrying a basket of pruning shears, his movements slow and deliberate. "You're still here," he said, a note of surprise in his voice. "Most people leave when they realize what this place is." Elara looked up from her soil sample. "What is this place?" she asked. Matteo set down his basket and leaned against the well. Dante's mother, Rosalina, she was the heart of this vineyard. She knew every vine, every root, every bee. When she died, something broke in Dante. He became harder, colder, and the people around him, they saw an opportunity. He paused, his pale eyes meeting hers. Victoria Hale was Rosalina's friend, or so she claimed. But I saw things. I saw Victoria whispering with the lawyers after the funeral. I saw her moving papers when she thought no one was watching. She wants this land, Signorina. She wants it badly. Elara's blood ran cold. Why are you telling me this? She whispered. Matteo shrugged, a sad, weary gesture. Because you listen, like Rosalina did. And because the bees trust you. That means something. He picked up his basket and walked away, leaving Elara alone with the weight of his words. She sat on the edge of the well for a long time, the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place in her mind. Victoria was not just a cruel investor. She was a predator, and she was poisoning the vineyard to force Dante to sell. The lab results arrived on the 5th day, delivered by a courier in an unmarked black car. Elara opened the envelope with trembling fingers and read the report 3 times, her disbelief growing with each pass. The soil from the western slope contained high concentrations of a rare herbicide, one that was banned in commercial agriculture, but could still be obtained on the black market. It was designed to mimic natural plant blight, killing vines slowly and making it look like a disease outbreak. It was brilliant, in a horrifying way, and it was working. Elara took the report straight to Dante. She found him in the vineyard, standing alone among the dying vines of the western slope. He was not wearing his usual dark sweater today, but a simple white shirt with the sleeves rolled up, and for the first time, he looked less like a Mafia boss and more like a man grieving something he could not name. He turned when he heard her footsteps, and his expression sharpened when he saw the papers in her hand. "You found something," he said. Elara handed him the report. "It's herbicide. Deliberate. Someone has been poisoning this section for months, maybe longer. The bees knew. That's why they stayed away." Dante read the report in silence, his jaw tightening with each line. When he finished, he looked up at the dying vines, and his voice was barely a whisper. "Who?" "I don't have proof yet," Elara said carefully, "but I have suspicions, and I think you do too." Dante's eyes met hers, and in them, she saw a storm of rage and betrayal. "Victoria," he said. It was not a question. "She's been pressuring me to sell for a year. She said the vineyard was failing, that I was throwing good money after bad. She offered to buy it herself, at a fraction of its value. I thought she was just being a vulture. I didn't think she was the one killing it." He crumpled the report in his fist, his knuckles white. "She was my mother's friend. She held my mother's hand when she was dying. And all this time she was poisoning the land my mother loved." Elara felt a surge of emotion, a mix of anger and sorrow and something else, something that felt dangerously like protectiveness. "We need more evidence," she said. "The lab results prove the poison, but they don't prove who applied it. We need to catch her in the act, or find something that ties her directly to the herbicide." Dante looked at her, and for the first time, there was something like respect in his gaze. "You're not just a beekeeper, are you?" he said. "You're a strategist." Elara felt her cheeks flush. "I'm just someone who pays attention," she said, "and I don't like bullies." Dante stepped closer to her, close enough that she could smell his cologne, something dark and woodsy. "Then help me," he said, his voice low and intense. "Help me take her down. Not just for the vineyard, for my mother, for everyone she's ever hurt." Elara looked up at him, at the pain and fury warring in his eyes, and she nodded. "I'll help you," she said, "but we do this my way, quietly, carefully. The bees will show us the truth." Dante's hand reached out, almost involuntarily, and brushed a strand of hair from her face. The touch was gentle, shockingly so for a man known for his ruthlessness. "You are the strangest woman I have ever met," he murmured, "and the most remarkable." The plan came together over the next week. Elara continued her work with the bees, but now she was also watching. She noted every visit Victoria made to the vineyard, every conversation she had with the vineyard manager, every time she walked alone toward the western slope. She set up small, hidden cameras near the affected area, disguised as birdhouses and irrigation equipment. She collected more samples, building a timeline of the poisoning, and she talked to Matteo, who became her silent ally, sharing decades of knowledge about the land and the people who worked it. One evening, as the sun set over the vineyard in a blaze of gold and crimson, Elara sat on the porch of her cottage, her journal open on her lap. She was so absorbed in her notes that she did not hear Dante approach until he was standing right beside her. He was carrying 2 glasses of wine, and he offered one to her without a word. She took it, their fingers brushing, and a spark of electricity shot up her arm. "You've been working too hard," he said, sitting down on the step beside her. "You need to rest." Elara shook her head. "I can't rest. Not until this is over. Victoria is getting bolder. I think she's planning something big." Dante sipped his wine, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "She's invited all the major investors to a tasting next week. She says it's to showcase the vineyard's potential, but I think it's a trap. She wants to humiliate me in front of them, prove that the vineyard is failing, and force me to sell." "Then we'll be ready," Elara said. "I'll have all the evidence by then. The soil tests, the camera footage, the timeline. We'll expose her in front of everyone." Dante turned to look at her, and his expression was unreadable. "You're risking a lot for me," he said. "For this land." "Why?" Elara considered the question. Why was she doing this? She had come here for a job, nothing more. But somewhere along the way, it had become personal. She had seen the way Victoria treated people, the casual cruelty, the greed. She had seen the pain in Dante's eyes when he talked about his mother, and she had felt, for the first time in her life, that her quiet way of seeing the world was not a weakness, but a weapon. "Because everyone underestimated me," she said finally, "and everyone underestimated this land. I want to prove them wrong." Dante set down his wine glass and took her hand. His grip was warm and firm, and it sent a shiver through her entire body. "You are not underestimated by me," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "From the moment I saw you, I knew you were different. You didn't flinch. You didn't beg for approval. You just listened. And you saw the truth when no one else could." He lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles, a gesture so old-fashioned and tender that it made her heart ache. "I will protect you," he said. "No matter what happens, you are under my protection now, and no one, not Victoria, not anyone, will ever make you feel small again." Elara felt tears prick at her eyes, but she blinked them back. She was not used to being protected. She was used to being invisible. But with Dante, she felt seen. She felt valuable. And she felt something else, something that terrified her more than any threat. She felt like she was falling in love with a man who could destroy anyone who crossed him, and who was looking at her like she was the most precious thing in his world. The night of the investor tasting arrived with a cold, clear sky and a tension that crackled in the air like static. The tasting room had been transformed into a glittering showcase of DeLuca wines, with crystal decanters, white tablecloths, and servers in black tie. The investors arrived in sleek cars, their laughter and chatter filling the space with a false sense of celebration. Elara stood near the back of the room, wearing a deep green dress that Dante had insisted on having made for her. It was velvet, soft and rich, and it hugged her curves in a way that made her feel both exposed and powerful. She had protested at first, but Dante had simply said, "You are not hiding tonight. You are the one who will save this vineyard. You deserve to be seen." Victoria swept into the room like a queen, her platinum hair gleaming under the chandeliers. She was wearing a white suit that screamed money and power, and she was surrounded by a coterie of admirers. When she saw Elara, her smile turned sharp and mocking. "Oh, the beekeeper is here," she announced, loud enough for everyone to hear. "How charming. Did you bring some honey for us to taste? Or are you just here to admire the wine you could never afford?" A few people laughed, but the sound was nervous, uncertain. They had all noticed the way Dante was watching Elara, the way he had not left her side all evening. Dante stepped forward, his presence commanding immediate silence. "Miss Vance is here because she has something important to share," he said, his voice cold and controlled. "Something that concerns everyone in this room." He nodded to Elara, and she took a deep breath. This was it, the moment of truth. She walked to the center of the room, her heels clicking on the marble floor, and she held up a small tablet that displayed the lab results and the camera footage she had collected. "For the past 6 months, this vineyard has been dying," she began, her voice steady, despite the pounding of her heart. "Everyone assumed it was a natural blight, but it wasn't. It was poison." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Victoria's smile faltered. "The bees knew," Elara continued. "They avoided the western slope because the soil there is contaminated with a banned herbicide, an herbicide that was deliberately applied, over and over, to kill the vines and make the vineyard look worthless." She tapped the tablet, and the lab results appeared on a large screen behind her. "These tests prove it, and this footage shows who applied it." The screen changed to show a video, grainy but unmistakable. Victoria Hale, dressed in dark clothes, walking through the western slope at night, carrying a spray canister. She was methodical, careful, but the cameras had caught her face clearly. The room erupted in gasps and shouts. Victoria's face went white, then red with fury. "That's a lie," she screamed. "That footage is fake. She's trying to destroy me." But no one was listening. The investors were backing away from Victoria, their expressions a mix of shock and disgust. Dante stepped forward, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. "Victoria Hale, you are no longer welcome on this land. You will leave tonight, and you will never return. If you do, I will not be responsible for what happens." The threat was quiet, but it carried the weight of absolute certainty. Victoria looked around the room, her eyes wild, searching for an ally. She found none. The man she had been conspiring with, the vineyard manager, had already slipped out the back door. She was alone. With a strangled cry of rage, she grabbed her bag and stormed out, her heels clattering on the marble like gunshots. The room was silent for a long moment. Then, one by one, the investors began to clap. It was not a polite applause. It was the sound of people who had just witnessed a reckoning. Dante turned to Elara, and in front of everyone, he took her hand. "This woman saved my vineyard," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. "She saw what no one else could see. She listened when even the bees refused to lie. And she is the reason this land will survive." He lifted her hand and kissed it, just as he had done on the porch. But this time, it was a public declaration. Elara felt tears streaming down her face, but she did not try to hide them. She had spent her whole life being invisible, being mocked, being told she was not enough. And now, in a room full of powerful people, she was being celebrated. Later that night, after the investors had left, and the tasting room was empty, Dante led Elara out to the vineyard. The moon was full, casting silver light over the rows of vines. The air was cool and clean. and somewhere in the distance, Elara could hear the soft hum of her bees. "You did it," Dante said, his voice low and full of wonder. "You saved everything." Elara shook her head. "We did it. I couldn't have done it without you, without Matteo, without everyone who believed in the truth." Dante turned to face her, his hands cupping her face with a gentleness that made her breath catch. "I have spent my whole life surrounded by lies," he said, "by people who wanted my power, my money, my name. But you, Elara Vance, you are the most honest thing I have ever known, and I am not letting you go." He kissed her then, under the moonlight, with the vineyard stretching around them like a promise. It was a kiss that tasted of wine and honey, and something that felt like hope. When they finally pulled apart, Elara was trembling. "What happens now?" she whispered. Dante smiled, a real smile that transformed his harsh features into something almost boyish. "Now, we rebuild. The vineyard, the truth, and maybe, if you'll let me, something between us." Elara looked up at him, at this dangerous, powerful man who had seen her worth when no one else had, and she nodded. "I'd like that," she said, and for the first time in her life, she felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. In the weeks that followed, the vineyard began to heal. The contaminated soil was removed and replaced, and new vines were planted on the western slope. Elara's bees returned to their normal patterns, pollinating the flowers and filling the hives with golden honey. Victoria Hale's reputation was destroyed, and she disappeared from the wine world entirely, her name a byword for betrayal. Dante and Elara grew closer, their relationship deepening with every shared sunrise and every quiet evening on the porch. He never tried to change her, never asked her to be anything other than what she was. And she, in turn, learned to see the man behind the Mafia boss, the son who still grieved his mother, the leader who would do anything to protect the people he loved. One afternoon, as the autumn leaves began to turn, Elara stood on the western slope and watched the bees dance among the new vines. Matteo was beside her, his old eyes crinkled with a smile. "You did good, Signorina," he said. "Rosalina would have liked you." Elara felt a lump in her throat. "I wish I could have met her," she said. Matteo nodded. "She's still here, in the land, in the bees, in the way Dante looks at you." He patted her shoulder and walked away, leaving her alone with the hum of the hive and the golden light of the setting sun. Dante found her there an hour later. He was carrying a small velvet box, and his expression was uncharacteristically nervous. "Elara," he said, his voice rough, "I know we haven't known each other long, but I also know that I have never met anyone like you. You walked into my life with mud on your boots and honey in your hair, and you changed everything." He opened the box, revealing a ring with a deep green emerald, the color of healthy vines. "I'm not asking you to marry me, not yet, but I am asking you to stay, to be my partner, in the vineyard, in everything." Elara looked at the ring, then at the man who was offering it, and she felt her heart swell with a joy she had never thought possible. "Yes," she said simply, "I'll stay." He slipped the ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly. Then he pulled her into his arms, and they stood together on the hill, watching the sun set over the vineyard that had brought them together. The bees hummed their quiet song, the vines rustled in the evening breeze, and Elara Vance, the curvy beekeeper who had been called strange and useless and invisible, knew that she had finally found her home. Not just a place, but a person. A man who saw her, who valued her, who loved her, and she knew, with a certainty as deep as the roots of the oldest vine, that she would never be underestimated again.